This week in the boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member. And last week we took a look at the Audit Committee's relationship with the external auditor. And we've asked Trent Gazzaway, who's the National Managing Partner of Audit Services for Grant Thornton, to come back and join us again because we couldn't get through all of our questions. So Trent, welcome back.
Thank you.
Today we want to look at sort of the Audit Committee's role and structure, and want to talk about some issues with that. And I think where I'd like to start is, you know, we get a lot of questions about how the Audit Committee should be conveying its information back to the full board. You know, is it just minutes? You know, what kind of communication could there be? Because ultimately the entire board is responsible for the actions of the Audit Committee. So talk a little bit about what you've experienced and maybe in the way of best practices as far as communicating Audit Committee to full board.
Right. Well, when you take a step back and look at how this interaction works, you mentioned that the full board is responsible for, you know, making sure that the Audit Committee is doing its job right. The full board is responsible for making sure that the Compensation Committee and the Governance Committee and any other committee is actually working effectively. So there's a reason we have committee structures out there. It's so that the board can divide and conquer and go get the hard work of the board done. But at the end of the day, that all needs to roll back up to the top. And so every Audit Committee and full board need a good interaction between the two. And the way that I like to see that happen, or the way I've seen it work the best, is when the committees, including the Audit Committee, report back to the full board on the major things that they've done and what has come out of that process. So I would expect that the Audit Committee would come to the board and explain how they have exercised their responsibility to oversee the financial reporting process of the issuer itself and to oversee the external auditor, to manage the whistleblower hotline, things that are baked into the law, actually into the Sarbanes-Oxley law for the Audit Committee. That doesn't mean they need to replay all of the conversations and everything that happened, but they need to be able to explain to the board how they exercise their oversight responsibilities. Then they need to be able to discuss the major things that came out of that. So just taking the Audit Committee piece for a second, and the Audit Committee and the auditor should have entered into a robust dialogue about complex areas of accounting, significant judgments and estimates, high-risk areas. When I say high-risk areas, areas that are at a higher risk for misstatement in the financial statements. Those things should have all been robust conversations in the Audit Committee meeting with the external auditor and with management and with the internal auditor. The Audit Committee ought to be summarizing all of that and bubbling up those things to the board so that the board understands what the high-risk areas are. We are a company that enters into percentage of completion accounting, and percentage of completion accounting has some complexity to it. We're an organization that enters into a lot of leasing transactions, and by the way, the accounting guidance related to leasing is in flux right now, and it's probably going to change, and these are the big things that the board needs to know. It's taking what happened in the Audit Committee level, synthesizing it down to the high points, those higher risk points, and giving the full board a level of comfort that, yes, the Audit Committee has done what it's supposed to do.
You know, it's funny, first of all, when you think of the committees, that's a challenge, because,
right.
and it takes a good coordination between the corporate secretary and the head of the committee and the chairman of the board, right. To make sure that that does get synthesized down and is an efficient way for that to be presented. I'm surprised at the number of companies that are opening their committee meetings to full board members, right. Meaning that's one way that I can communicate this, and I'm surprised at the number of directors that actually take advantage of that. Yet I can't imagine that happening at, say, a Fortune 100 company, that
Right.
that somebody could give that much time.
I think on the surface there's a tendency to believe the more the merrier. But I think we need to be careful with how we approach the kind of the full board becoming the audit committee in large organizations. In small organizations that don't have a named audit committee, legally the full board is the audit committee. But when we look at, when you get to be a larger organization, the board only has so much time available to all of the board members to be able to execute its responsibilities. And so you have to make sure, that's the reason we created the committee structure to start with as companies get larger, as I mentioned, so that the board can divide and conquer. I have been involved in a lot of audit committee meetings where the full board was invited. I would suggest that the majority of the time that happens, it should be because there are unique risk considerations at play. Something significant has happened. Maybe there's a major transaction with some highly complex accounting. Maybe there are some allegations of fraud, and we need to kind of circle the wagons and make sure that we deal with this appropriately. But I would let the committees actually be the committees to the extent possible. The audit committee, if it has the right people on it, and the right accounting and auditing skill set, or access to the right accounting and auditing skill sets, is going to do a better job in that smaller group of getting down to the right answer and being able to report back up to the top. Otherwise, you run the risk of diluting the effectiveness of the board as a whole.
Yeah. One of the big debates is what ends up in the audit committee. You know, in the last show we talked about cyber risk and
Right.
those responsibilities. There's always the debate of enterprise risk management, of, you know, there's so many risks outside of the financial reporting.
Right.
That's the case where clearly our research shows that it's about, you know, a 60-40 split, with 60% feeling that it should be a full board function. Yet I would bet if we went in and did a poll of where it resides today, probably more than 60% it still resides in the audit committee. So what's your experience with that?
Well, I would say that one of the things that's happened is the exchanges, in particular the New York Stock Exchange, added some language in their governance rules that suggests that the audit committee, specifically naming the audit committee, should have discussions with management about their risk management processes. There's some logic in that because the elements of enterprise risk management impact the financial statements. And since they impact the financial statements, the audit committee has to be aware of those things. The danger is that if we take that one step too far, then we make the audit committee the owner of enterprise risk management. And really the full board is the owner of enterprise risk management for the whole company. And then they delegate responsibility for managing that risk to the management team. And early on, I would say probably 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, we saw more audit committees that were too deep into enterprise risk management and were giving some sort of enterprise risk management report to the board as if they were the ERM committee. What we have seen more lately is boards starting to form their own enterprise risk management committees, having audit committee representation on it for the reasons that I stated earlier. And I think that's getting back to what's the healthy way to utilize the resources on the board. I think that's a healthy way to do it. I think if the audit committee becomes the enterprise risk management function for the whole company, or the enterprise risk management oversight function, I think it dilutes their ability to oversee the financial reporting process and the external auditor and the whistleblower program, things that they are also specifically required to do. So I think it's important to be cognizant of how much we put on the audit committee. And it can vary depending on the company. Some companies are highly complex with a lot of different risks out there. There are a lot of things that could kind of take the organization down. And those need enterprise risk management committees that are standalone and can devote the complete time and attention to the concept of enterprise risk management. Smaller, simpler companies, it may be easier to fold that in with the audit committee or a subset of the audit committee.
Yeah. Outside of financial services, we really haven't seen that big a percentage of companies have a risk committee. It makes some sense on the surface, and in fact I saw one institution that actually had a chairman of the risk committee, and then its members were made up of the nom-gov chair, the comp chair, and the audit chair. And that way there was always going to be good communication across all the committees. One of the arguments is there's validation for an environmental committee, there's validation for, next thing you know, you've got so many committees that you either have to expand the board or somebody's spending a week on committee meetings.
That's right. That's right. And when we talk about enterprise risk management, and I've been dealing in this space since the mid-90s, it's still in its infancy, believe it or not. 20 years later, we still don't fully have a good enough framework. COSO's come up with a framework, and there are other frameworks out there, but they're not being employed effectively enough in a practical way. And I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be put into that. And certainly how the governance structure works in the organization and how the board and the audit committee and other committee members interact is an important part of that. At the end of the day, when we talk about enterprise risk management, we're talking about things that can really, I say take the company down, but can really prevent the organization from achieving its stated objectives. That's really what you need to be focused on. And if you're not careful, you throw everything, including the kitchen sink, into the pot, and it becomes unworkable. So good enterprise risk management has a small group of people that have the ability to reach out across the whole organization and identify those critical things that could really prevent us as an organization from achieving our stated objectives, and boil those down to the top 10, top 15, pick a number, and then chase those down in terms of what are our responses to the risk and how are we managing it.
Well, I can't let you leave today without asking you about the issue that is probably the hottest issue as far as the governance goes these days, and that's this shareholder engagement, concept where shareholders, particularly institutional shareholders, or maybe we can even classify that as activist institutional shareholders, want access to committee chairs, mostly the comp chair, but also the audit chair. In fact, they want access even to the nom-gov chair. They want access to everybody.
Right.
But my question for you is, so one of your clients comes to you and say, should we engage or not engage? So what happens when you get that question?
Well, the first thing I say is that I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV. I would be very careful about the legal requirements here. We in the U.S. we have Regulation FD, and you want to make sure that you don't put yourself as an organization in the place of providing information to a subset of people that isn't available in a broader context, because you could be in violation of the law. So I'd make sure I got some legal counsel before I did anything with a small group. But one of the concepts, and you and I have kicked around this concept in the past, was maybe have an audit committee meeting that is open to the public. Not open in the sense that an analyst call is open, but you're willing to take shareholders and receive some questions from those shareholders in advance. Yeah. And then answer those questions in a more open setting, so that investors have a way of getting their questions answered, their legitimate questions answered. You want to be careful that it's controlled and you don't wind up getting a lot of the crazy kind of questions that are really unrelated to what the audit committee's responsibilities are. But to the extent that there are reasonable questions about how the audit committee is overseeing things and how the financial reporting process is working, then I think it's a good thing to improve that dialogue between the company and the investing public. That's where we're getting the capital to make these companies successful. So.
Well, I think we can both agree that it's going to be a very interesting year in shareholder engagement. I think there will be some companies that do it and that sort of set the bar, and activists will use that as pressure. At the same time, I think there'll be some abuses to it, where single interest and people that just want access to embarrass, particular individuals because they aren't happy, will have people withdrawing that. So we'll have to see how it plays out for the year. But one thing for sure is I don't think we're going to avoid the debate. I think the debate is here for good. So, well, Trent, it's enjoyable. There's a couple things. First of all, I want to thank Grant Thornton for its support. It gives us the ability to, sort of push this show out and keep information in front of our directors and our followers. Second of all, I know, and I didn't have this in my notes, but I think that you are the author or the co-author of a audit committee guide handbook.
Yep.
And co-author.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make sure that somebody, if they're curious on following up on some of this, where can they possibly get a copy of the handbook?
Certainly, it's called the Audit Committee Handbook. It's in its 5th edition now. It's available on Amazon.com. But if anybody wants just to reach out to me personally for a copy, I'd be happy to get them a copy. My email address is trent.gazzaway@us.gt.com.
And I'll ask our group there if they can put that up on the screen. Trent, again, thanks for joining us. That will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom, and we hope you'll join us again next week. We'll take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or a committee member, and we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.